Alright, so the latest entry in the MCU, Ant-Man and the Wasp, is set to be released in the US later this week on July 6th, and personally, I can't wait to see it. It looks like it's going to be a ton of fun.
You gave her wings?
And blasters.
So I take it you didn't have that tech available for me?
No, I did.
And even with the movie set to further explore the quantum realm dimension introduced in the first movie, as well as featuring Marvel's newest villain, the Ghost, and some potentially pretty kick-ass fight scenes thanks to her power set, I think one of the things I'm most excited to see is the return of Hank Pym's physics-shattering serum known as Pym particles, aka the stuff that lets both Scott, and later Hope, alter their size at will. I mean, it just looks so awesome, being able to shrink and grow to crazy sizes with just the literal push of a button. Could you imagine if we were able to do that stuff in real life? Well, I can, and I don't know about you guys, but I'm pretty sure that if Pym particles actually existed in real life, trying to make somebody as small as an ant or as big as a building really wouldn't turn out all that well. Now true, an ant-sized human would be pretty damn strong compared to a normal-sized person.
When your small energy's compressed, so you have the force of a 200-pound man behind a fist 1/100 of an inch wide, you're like a bullet.
But at the same time, anybody shrunk into that size wouldn't have the time to fully enjoy it, since pretty much all their bodily functions wouldn't work right anymore. This is because of something called the square cube law, or the idea that as a shape changes in size, its internal volume and surface area will also change, but at different rates. So for example, if we had a cube with equal sides of, say, 1 meter, then it'll have a surface area of 6 square meters and a volume of 1 cubic meter. But if we scale that cube up and give it sides of, say, 20 meters, then it'll have a surface area of 2,400 square meters and a volume of 8,000 cubic meters. And that's really important because it basically means that you can't take a human and just make them small. Like, it just can't biologically work. Take for instance our body temperature. See, plants and animals, including humans, regulate their internal temperature through a process called Thermo Regulation, which is basically your body's way of keeping itself in that nice sweet spot of not freezing or burning to death when it gets cold or hot outside. The reason this is important as far as an ant-sized superhero goes is because this process is related to our surface area to volume ratio. So while a normal-sized human has more mass, meaning they have a greater internal volume, which would allow them to gain and lose heat at a slower pace, allowing them to safely regulate their body temperature, an ant-sized human would have a much harder time being able to do the same thing. Smaller animals typically gain and lose heat pretty rapidly thanks to their larger surface area to volume ratio, meaning our ant-sized superhero would have to drastically increase their metabolic rate if they wanted to not freeze to death. This means Scott would have to supply his body with much more fuel, to the point where he'd probably have to eat an amount of food equal to his own weight daily just to stay alive. Meanwhile, Scott would also be constantly struggling to breathe, since the hemoglobin in his blood would probably be way too small to carry oxygen molecules through his body, assuming his lungs could even process the now relatively much larger oxygen molecules. Scott would effectively get knocked out before he ever got to throw a single punch, although he would still get ignored by Tony Stark, so I guess it's not like things would have changed all that much.
Pym always said you never can trust a Stark. Who are you? Come on, man.
Really though, the biggest issue Scott would face is the massive increase in his density. Long story short, if you took Paul Rudd's about 78 kilograms and crammed it into the 7.2 millimeter height he normally reaches after shrinking, as I pointed out in my other Ant-Man video, feel free to check it out, then he'd be about 17 times denser than a white dwarf star, one of the densest materials in the universe. You think he'd be able to run on people or fly around on an ant?
You serious?
Seriously, Scott would be so dense, he'd fall right through the floor and straight through the earth. And this is apparently a design choice.
When I took over this company for Dr. Pym, I immediately started researching a particle that could change the distance between atoms while increasing density and strength.
Seriously, who's the fucking genius who came up with that one?
Increasing density.
Arguably though, things would be even worse whenever Scott decided to flip the switch and turn into Giant Man. Much like when he gets tiny, growing doesn't seem to actually do anything different to Scott than simply making him bigger, which leads to a whole bunch of new health problems. Remember how I mentioned earlier that Scott would potentially freeze to death whenever he shrunk down as Ant-Man? Well, growing taller than a building would have the complete opposite effect, meaning Scott would be retaining too much heat and therefore would run the risk of hyperthermia. And on top of that, he'd be almost useless in a fight, considering how his reaction time would be a good bit slower than a normal-sized human. Forget about casually backhanding Spider-Man, that dude would have absolutely laid out Scott if he wanted to. That is, of course, assuming that Scott would even be able to join a fight in the first place, seeing as his body would completely fall apart if he even tried to move. Seriously, if Scott grew to his apparently maximum height of 65 feet...
My record? 21 feet. You?
65 feet.
65.
which if you've seen my other Ant-Man video, you'll remember is actually taller than a dinosaur, then his legs would definitely snap under his increased weight. Remember that square cube law I mentioned earlier in this video? Well, the strength of a bone is approximately proportional to its cross-sectional area. Like, it's the reason why an elephant has such huge legs, relatively speaking, compared to something like a deer. It needs all that extra strength in its legs to hold up all that extra bulk. Or alternatively, you could also just swap out the material the bones are made of and replace them with something stronger that can withstand massive weights and still function like a normal bone. Something like that could support something Giant Man sized. But like I said earlier, Scott as Giant Man doesn't really go through any type of body modifications when he grows, he just gets bigger. With an increase in Scott's size but no change to the shape of his bones or the material they're made of, the load on his bones would increase to the point where his giant body would eventually collapse under its own weight. Now, having gone through just a few of the health problems using the Pym particles would give you, I will admit you could probably hand wave away a lot of them by just saying the suit helps support Scott when he's shrinking or growing somehow. Like, maybe those lenses help light better enter his eyes when he's tiny, and maybe that mouthpiece both helps him breathe and enhances his voice so normal sized people can hear him. But geez, it seems like Pym particles would create way more problems than they actually solve. And that's just out of the stuff we can actually explain.
40 years ago, I created a formula that altered atomic relative distance. If that regulator is compromised, you would go subatomic. I learned how to change the distance between atoms. Subatomic. Change the distance between atoms. Subatomic.
Seriously, does Hank even understand how his own particles work? Well, maybe he does, and all this stuff we've been told about the Pym particles is really just a bunch of bullshit to keep other people from figuring out how they work? But maybe that's a video for another time. But anyways guys, that's my take on why Scott Lang's shrinking and growing abilities would definitely suck ass in real life. If you guys agreed with anything I said in this video, or if you have your own theories you want to throw out there, then go ahead and let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, I will see you all next time. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, then go ahead and click that like button, and if you're new, maybe consider clicking that subscribe button too. I've also got links to my Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, Instagram, and Patreon in the description. You should probably check those out too. And if you want to see more of my content, then you can click the link to my last video. It's right there in the middle of your screen. Alright, and I will see you all next time.